when I spoke with Michael about the conferences and everything else, he suggested that we can have a presentations or not, basically like whatever is easier for the speakers.
Right.
Right?
Okay. Yeah, cool. So I have some slides prepared. It's it's already 17 past. So if it's okay with you guys, maybe we'll get started. And if other people join, you know, great. Otherwise, you know, we'll keep it a nice, intimate conversation. So you guys can jump in wherever you like.
Yeah. Sure.
Okay, cool. So we're going to talk today about distributed generation, right? Which is just another way of saying forms that are not centralized, right? So non-power plants. So solar power, right? Renewables, you know, are what I'm focused on. But you know, it could be cogeneration, right? CHP, combined heat and power. There's different examples of distributed generation. And a microgrid, it just means that it has the ability to island, right? So without the megagrid, without the major utility, or it can connect to the utility. So that, just to clarify two terms. So the problem that we're looking to address here is with the existing utility grid infrastructure. So as we know, my experience is in the States. Our infrastructure is terribly aged. There's tons of power outages all the time because they just have not been maintained over the past 100 or so years. And so there's a lot of issues now that have been brought out. And we all, as ratepayers in that utility territory, are paying the price, right? Literally, our rates are continuously going up because of the aged infrastructure. So that's one issue that microgrids try to address. In developing nations, we have a totally different opportunity where, similar to telecom, areas that did not have landlines have been able to leapfrog over that technology and go straight to mobile connection. And so the same thing here with electricity. Developing nations have the ability not to create centralized power plants with a centralized or mega grid, as they call it, infrastructure, and they can create microgrids instead. In terms of things like cyber attacks, terrorism, climate change, where I'm sure you saw, like in California this past year, they had to have planned shutdowns, right? Preventative shutdowns because of all the wildfires. They were afraid that they would catch on power lines, you know, from the trees. And so they literally voluntarily took away power from millions of people in California. So that's an example of planned. And then, of course, you have the typical power outages where the utilities, you know, forever just have not been able to keep up with demand all the time. And so many programs have been launched, like demand response, in order to try to combat the issue of power outage. In terms of pricing and control, the major issue, and in terms of why renewables have been so exciting, like putting solar power on your home, is because this is the one opportunity that ratepayers get to control their pricing. So let's talk about the microgrid market a little bit. Right now, it's still relatively small, so it's probably somewhere in the $20+ billion range in 2019 and 2020. By 2024, it's predicted that it will be about a $36 billion market. And this is how it kind of breaks down, right? So you have most sites will be very small, right? So up to 1 megawatt. So homes would be a good example that you see here on the chart. Buildings would also potentially be under 1 megawatt if they're not too big. Probably a Manhattan skyscraper would be over 1 megawatt. That would be probably more like medium size. But you know, a typical building that has, let's say, 10,000 square feet, 50,000 square feet, something in that order, can probably be accommodated with up to 1 megawatt of microgrid. And this would give the building, or that block in some cases, the ability to totally control their pricing, right? So they can decide when to power their renewables, when to store that power in a battery, when to charge cars, when to charge other equipment, and when to connect to the grid and when to disconnect to the grid. So these are some of the advantages here about microgrids. Our approach is to have this complete solution. We're technology agnostic, as you'll see, but we believe that we should come in with a strong offering to finance everything, so there's no cost to the building owner, homeowner, municipality, whoever the off-taker or customer is. And so we've created what's called a storage power agreement. The batteries are really what has allowed the microgrid to take place, right? We've had solar for a long time, but it didn't really have the level of storage that we have today, in terms of capability. And so this is really what has been the game changer in terms of batteries, right? So we have from the customer to the financing, to the installation, to whatever government or utility incentives are available through the completion of the project. And since we're technology agnostic, we can work with a Tesla battery, with LG, with Sharp, with BYD, which is a Chinese manufacturer, and any other provider that has a good solution for that particular application. So the same thing with cars. We would plan to be able to work with any manufacturer of cars that has a vehicle to grid integration, so that when the car is parked and connected, whether it's to the home or to a business, they'd be able to determine whether they want to take power from the grid or from the microgrid, or when they want to give power, right? So this dynamic pricing is what's really, really exciting. In terms of the stability, the batteries, because the prices have come down and because the energy density has gone up so much, we're now able to offer a stable power supply, uninterrupted, even when there's grid outage, right? So this would work similar if you're familiar with natural gas or diesel generators. So in the same way that those diesel generators would have an automatic transfer switch, right? So automatically when the grid shuts down, these systems would kick in. So that combination of renewables with some sort of a storage device would already have the power immediately for impact. So that's what's exciting these days. And in the same way that this can be switched on in a power outage, it can also be switched on or off in terms of dynamic pricing. If it was determined that utility pricing was too expensive at that particular moment in time, same thing. Automatic transfer switch can flip off from the megagrid and only take local power from the microgrid. What's also nice in terms of these systems is that they can be totally mobile. So there can be built-in systems into a home or building or neighborhood, or they can be containerized, like you see here. This is a 500 kilowatt battery container. And so, think about retail stores, think about whole villages or neighborhoods. These can be brought in, and for some reason, if they wanted to switch out the technology or move it to another location, that's totally fine. It could be moved relatively easily and connected and disconnected pretty easily. This is our kind of structure. So we have the financing that comes in from our investor partners into our fund, and then we have the actual operations and maintenance that our subcontractors take care of. And then as we develop and build the microgrids, those get set up into individual SPVs wherever they are. Another exciting market, separate from the backup power itself, is the ability to trade through the capacity market. This is specific to the US. I'd love to hear if they offer it in your markets, but it's really exciting in that if we can make that capacity available from the microgrid to the megagrid, or from one particular part of the megagrid to another, we would be able to enter into contracts with either the utility or, as we have in the US, what's called ISOs, or independent system operators. And these are bodies that work with multiple utilities through multiple states, and can trade the power depending on where it's needed most, depending on where the prices are highest or lowest, and make those trades and play that arbitrage. Something very similar in terms of smart thermostats, what they're able to do within a microgrid. These have the ability to trade within nodes, right? So each utility in the megagrid is broken down into kind of clusters, or what they call nodes, N-O-D-E-S, nodes. And those nodes can comprise, 10,000 homes, 100,000 homes, depending on the grid. And once we have the ability to control what goes on in that building or home, then we can say, because of these predictive analytics, we can say, well, tomorrow it's supposed to be 1 degree warmer than today, and so we predict that people will want to raise their lower their thermostat, to accommodate for that 1 degree. Now, if we can control that degree, we can actually create a trade out of that by making that control and offering that savings to another node. And so these dynamic pricings, whether they're in dollars or really can be any currency. They can be new currencies, they can be currencies that are dedicated specifically to these models. And this is something that really couldn't exist long ago. Even if the thought process was there, you really didn't have the machine learning in order to really make a profitable trade. There's a little bit about us. And these are some examples of some of the communities that we've been designing for development, where they're kind of like live, work, play. Everything can be done, within these, and they can island, right? They can act as complete microgrids. So if there's an act of terrorism, or if there's any issue with the grid, these can totally be isolated. People can grow food here. That's what you're looking at, here in the bottom picture. There's agriculture, there's co-working space, there's just everything that someone would need in order to create a self-sufficient community right then and there. So that's it for the slides. So if you guys have any particular thoughts, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what this looks like in your area, what your experience has been in terms of energy and trading and renewables, and share a little bit more.
Well, to be honest, this was a really amazing presentation. In terms of the renewables here in this part of the world, I do have to say that this part of the world is really late with all of that. I mean, they are still basically building highways on like specific areas of the region, so they are not thinking a lot about like renewable sources. Instead of that, they are actually investing the money in building the power plants on the water, and they will actually destroy one of like the most beautiful rivers here because of that. But if they would just go on the renewable side, on the mountains which we have here, basically to build like sections for renewable energy and everything else, it would be like a lot better and a lot easier. But having these things being implemented around the world is definitely a beautiful sign of progress. So yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I've heard that before, that in countries that are developing a bit more, really are going through, unfortunately, a similar process that that countries, went through many years ago, and are not adopting, the latest and greatest technologies. And probably the number one cause is just education. So yeah, it's interesting to understand what their background is. I'm not sure if it's coming from the government or if you have kind of one major utility that's driving this, and they're just looking at it from a profitability perspective. But there really is a way that they can potentially make more profit by going straight to this route. So if it's something that you're looking to get involved with, I'm happy to help.
I could not agree more. I mean, here they are just focused on the profitability side of the things, but this is something extremely, extremely good. I'm not sure what kind of feedback does the rest of the people here have.
Yep. Cool. Antoine or Jessica. Hi, Jessica. I see you just joined. But so we just went through the presentation, and I'm happy to kind of share other thoughts. But do you have any experience or ideas in terms of microgrids in general, or any thoughts that you're working on? Hi, Pascal.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Good.
Okay, cool.
Am I in the right room, guys, or?
We're just talking about microgrids.
Okay,
So,
cool.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So yeah, I went through the slides, but I'm happy to go back a little bit. Maybe just give a few highlights. And so the problem that we're looking to tackle here is the issue we have with aged infrastructure, right? So my experience is coming from the infrastructure in the States.
Yeah.
So in my territory in New York, we have Con Edison, for those that are familiar. But in California, PG&E, many of these incumbent utilities all face the same problem. They have infrastructure that is 100 plus years old, and because it wasn't properly maintained over the years, which is just difficult and so costly to do anyway, there's just constant outages, and now with climate change and cyber attacks and terrorism, it just got compounded to a point where it's going to get more and more challenging over time. And so I'm sure you saw this past year that utilities like PG&E in California had these planned power outages where millions of homes and buildings had no power for extended periods of time because they were afraid that these wildfires, would cause lines to be brought down, and cause even more damage. And so microgrids, distributed generation in general, allow neighborhoods, homes, buildings, whether on their own or collectively in these larger microgrids that can have hundreds or thousands of facilities within them, allows them to create this dynamic pricing to both spend less, not necessarily be responsible for maintaining the entire transmission and distribution network, which is why rates have gone up so much over the years, just to maintain those, and just have this self-sufficiency, this independence. So these are some of the structures. These are some of the sites that have already begun to operate in this way. So right now, I estimate that it's somewhere in the $20 billion range in terms of the annual microgrid market. It'll be about 36 billion in the next few years, comprised mostly of these small under 1 megawatt locations, right? So that would be a home or a small building, a small community center, a school, perhaps a small school, that would really have the ability to connect and disconnect with the grid at will, right? So similar to diesel generation, for those that are familiar, or natural gas generators, those have an automatic transfer switch where that would flip on automatically once the grid is down or at will, right? So if dynamic pricing determined that it's more costly to stay connected to the grid, they can automatically switch over to the microgrid and utilize either the renewables directly, solar or wind or some other form of power generation, or they can take power from storage in the battery. In terms of the predictive analytics and the dynamic pricing, these trades can be made either with other microgrids, or these trades can be made directly with the megagrid. So we can jump to that. So one option is what's called the capacity market. And so this is one mechanism that historically independent system operators who are kind of overseeing multiple utilities in multiple states are able to trade ahead, either a day ahead, sometimes an hour ahead, or more, that capacity, right? So in the middle of August, if they know it's going to be extremely hot that next day, and everyone is going to want to switch on their air conditioning and other electric consumption, they can say, there's something called demand response. They can say, look, we will pay you not to use that extra elevator or something else in that building that would curtail that consumption. And that has a lot of value to it, right? Because historically, the utility or the ISO, independent system operator, would have had to turn on what they call these peaker plants, right? These very costly plants that are not always running. Generally, they would be diesel powered or some kind of an oil-based fuel, and they'd really prefer not to. So they sometimes have paid 3 or 4 times the cost per kilowatt hour that they're able to curtail in some kind of a demand response program. And so the capacity markets would work in a very similar way. If I have a bank of batteries, in the way that you see them here in the picture, of let's say 3 megawatts or 5 megawatt hours of power that I don't need right now, or that I will not need tomorrow at 1 to 2 p.m., I can sell that through the capacity markets and be compensated through that dynamic pricing model, very, very handsomely. This also works in homes, right, in individual applications. So all we really would need is to be able to control the temperature, the HVAC, just being the largest consumption in that property. And if we have the ability even to adjust 1 degree, on that same, very hot day where everyone is inclined to lower the temperature by 5 degrees. And so if we can just control 1 of those degrees, every homeowner, every building, everyone in that microgrid can agree to this curtailment and sell this either to another megagrid or another microgrid into this market, and everyone can make their percentage in a very profitable trade. So this is really an amazing kind of revolution that democratizes, that decentralizes the power markets, really away from the incumbent utilities, working with them and without them. So they still do play a very significant role, and I'm not suggesting that we don't need them anymore. That'll be a really long time until that happens. But at the very least, for now, the technologies all exist where we really can create these types of neighborhoods, communities, and cities that do have a lot more autonomy. So I'm really happy to open it up a bit and have a dialogue. We have a nice small group. I heard a bit about Irvin and what's happening in his area in terms of development of, unfortunately, large scale, and not necessarily the cleanest of power generation. If anyone else is willing to share what they're seeing in terms of power generation, I'm happy to chat about it. Or questions? Any thoughts?
Hi, I have a question.
Sure.
You talk about, I was late a little bit, and then you talked about ESG, right?
ESG?
Yeah. Did you talk about ESG? I'm sorry.
I did not. I did not. DG,
Oh.
distributed generation?
Distributed generation. Okay, okay. So sorry, I guess then, you know, yeah, I had a question about like the international standard,
Yeah.
you know, because whether it doesn't matter what it's called, but usually because I'm calling in from China, right? And you know, with this pandemic, there seems to be a trajectory that China is becoming a world of its own, right? And then you have the rest of the world, and then in order to do anything that has really a big impact, you face this like kind of a challenge of having different standards and different culture and, you know, different sort of metrics to talk with each other. So what might be the opportunities or the future potentials in you know, different cultures working together?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've tried to play around with this a little bit. So far, I have not figured out a way to execute these dynamic pricing trades if there's not some actual connection, right? Some physical transmission connection, right? So either between microgrids, right? So neighboring microgrids, or microgrids that are connected through a megagrid, right? So there still needs to be some actual way to transmit that electricity from one place to the other. Is it possible that at some point someone would figure out how to trade energy through conventional or novel currencies, you know, from the US to China? It's possible. I would love to see that. I have not figured out how to do that yet. You know, it might have to be through another kind of intermediary or clearinghouse or something. But as of now, all the research that I've done shows that there does have to be a physical connection in order to trade energy. Does that help kind of address what you were thinking in terms of standards?